Today, we want to thank you all so much for taking a half day, coming, spending it with us. Our goal is to go back and take the journey through Site 6. Some of this you will have seen before. Some of this will be completely new. And we know it's new because we just started doing it with you, or with people. So you should see a lot of different pieces to Site 6 today. And we will bring that all together. My name is Chris Funk. I am with Assessment System Performance, and we have a lot of people. We are finally, if you are familiar with the assessment office at all, we've been down bodies all summer, anywhere from 1 to 3 people. We now are back to a full house, so it's really good news. We have Austin Mueller. He is, and he's going to get really sick of this. He's the new Justin, but that puts him in context for you. So he'll be working with Tammy. He says.
I'm Tammy Melanson. I came from Rocky Heights. I joined in July-ish. I guess I worked a little bit in June, but in July.
She's been here all summer. Who's she kidding?
She's been here for years.
No, I haven't.
And my name's Jamie Bailey. I'm from the assessment office. I'm Vanna today. I'm the elementary version of these two people.
Yeah, right.
And I'm Sally Grants, I'm the assessment technology coordinator in the office.
So Kelly Kirkpatrick is now the new Lindsay for our DAC. So we now have a DAC, and then Matt Reynolds is the new Sina. It's really confusing. But there we go. That's who we all have. Today we are going to take a look at Site 6. We're going to be putting it into perspective. And our perspective, and I want you to start right now framing it this way. Site 6 is not about extra work. It's not about all the rules and regulations. It's about students. And more than that, it's about student learning and student growth. So we want to set that frame of mind in advance, and then we will continue to bring that up as we move through here. We are going to look at the relationship between the 3 steps. Somebody walked in yesterday and said, 3 steps? I thought there were 4. And no, there's 3. There were 4 attributes. There are now 3 attributes, but there's 3 steps. And so we are going to start talking about that. And then we are going to look at target setting and what that might look like. Now, we are going to talk at Mach speed. So just know we are cramming a lot of information in here. We have 17 of these trainings in the next 2 weeks. So we will be working with over about 800 people in all the Site 6 teams and all the Site 6 schools. So you're number 4, check, right? we are looking at that. We will look at next steps, think about communication plans. Site 6 is mandatory not only for all teachers in Douglas County this year, it is mandatory statewide this year. So every teacher in the state will be doing this, and every teacher in the state will have the same restrictions that we have and the same required elements that there's going to be a lot of, when it happens to us, it's happening across the board to all teachers throughout the state, just so we're aware of that. Our goal is to let teachers go a little after 10 and have leadership stay behind and figure out inspired if it's working. And if it's not, we will just say ciao to you too. And so just know that our intent is to show you how to set the model in Inspired today.
So some of what you will get to do today is the first part, we're going to try to give you a big overview of how does Site 6 fit in with Site 2? And we're hoping that Site 6 becomes a big piece of your Site 2 and it becomes more seamless so that it's not this standalone and you suddenly have to stop what you're doing and say, oh, I need to take an assessment because we have Site 6 to deal with. We want it to be part of your Site 2. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Our second piece, we're going to give you some time to process, think about what are the requirements, where would they fit best in our pie, what are the important things to me, where should I put assessments in that make the most sense for me, and then finally we're going to give you a chance to start thinking about how do I set growth targets. If that's what Site 6 is about, setting growth targets, having students grow, how do I go about doing that? How do I gather data? How do I make a target for students with 180 students potentially so that it's reasonable and I can deal with it logistically. So that's sort of the pieces. And then finally we'll get to Inspired. The principals in the room will get a chance to see the models, how to set the models, what those first couple of steps look like. We'll have a chance to have a little bit of a discussion around that. So hopefully through all of this, today our big thing is we hope that your perspective, you get a fresh perspective about how these 3 steps relate to one another. We sort of had several ahas over the summer about just how connected they are and how if you make a change in one of those steps, it does affect all the other steps. And so hopefully you'll get a chance to have a fresh perspective about that relationship.
And Tammy, I think our ahas happen almost every other day.
I think they do.
So we do recognize we live in this world, we're immersed in it. This is what we sit around and talk about because we have nothing better to do. And we just are there. So we learn something new every time we sit down and talk about this. If we ask you, or if you ask a question and we say, that's a good question, it's really because that's a good question. It's something we're grappling with. CDE has left this somewhat ambiguous and up to interpretation, and districts around the state are interpreting things a little bit differently. So we are working on coming to a common understanding. So please bear with us.
And then the last piece is just perspective around how Site 6 does fit into Site 2 and how we want that to be a bigger piece of just what we do, our day-to-day, and not have it be such a standalone. And so hopefully you'll feel that more at the end of today.
So, I'm going to do my music back here. So, when you hear the music, you are to stand behind your chair with nothing in your hand. When you hear the music, you are to start mingling around the room. And while you are mingling around the room, you need to touch 2 tables, touch 3 chairs, go touch a poster, give people high fives, tell them.
Spread germs.
Spread germs, yeah, put the germs in. And you're going to keep moving until the music stops. When the music stops, you stop. Okay.
Start.
Awesome. Good times. Good When you hear the directions, you are going to get into a group of 3. Take a minute, make sure everybody knows more than what high school you're from. So when you hear the music, you're going to get in a group of 3, do quick introductions, and then you're going to wait for the next set of directions. Join us. I'm not on an island by myself. Oh my gosh, look at that. When you hear the music, you are going to, in your group of 3, respond to the following. Why do we use assessments? What's the purpose of assessments? Make sure everybody has the opportunity to do a quick talk. What's the purpose of assessments?
See what children know, instruction, get them to where they need to be. Thank you, Rex. You are the best. Glorious. Good to meet you. How are you? Good.
Turn so you can see me.
We purposely planned this so we don't have to rely on internet and networks. So, Tammy, you want?
Sure. I want to give you just some norms about the day and some ways to communicate with us so that we can help you out. We have cups at your table, and those are really for you to tell us where you are, if you're working as a group and you're having conversations. So if you have a green cup up, we are assuming that all is well and you are moving along and having great conversations. If we see a yellow cup, we're assuming that you would like us at some point to come over and join that conversation, help you out, maybe answer a question, but it's not pressing. If we see a red cup, we understand that you're saying, come help us. We need to have a question answered before we move any further. And so we'll look at those as much as we can. We have enough people in the room that we should be able to get to you, especially if you go red. We should be able to help you out. The other piece that we want you to hear is this is a very small chunk of time, and you may as a building feel that it would be nice to have us for a bigger chunk of time, maybe just specifically for your building. And so if you feel that need, feel free to contact us, and we are more than willing to come out to your building and sit with you and process with you and help you as a Site 6 team make this work for you. And so know that if this doesn't do it for you, we're open to that. The other piece is we really don't have a lot of time, so we're going to, as well as we can, try to declutter the message, keep the workflow moving. And so we have some other things available to you. One of the things that's at your table is you should have some iPads, and if you end up, and the truth is we want you to put questions in there, but as you work and process and you have questions that maybe seem bigger than a 2-minute or 5-minute conversation, please add those and continue to add those. We are collecting that information. Matt will get a chance to see those questions, and we will then have a way to sort of frame our next work with you. So please know that that's available to you, and that will stay open for several days. So.
And the questions are, any question is a valid question. Please include it. A lot of the questions you're going to ask are ones that we've been trying to find answers to. So if we have them from you as well as us, it adds weight and meaning to it. So please do that. Put anything in there.
Mm-hmm. And then just as far as questions are concerned, if you have individual questions, we're going to ask that you wait until we are in that work time so that we can come to your table. If it is a question that seems like it would be good for the room, we will definitely bring it to the group, and we'll talk as a group at that point. You picked up a card when you walked in this morning, and that card is sort of representative of how we're feeling about Site 6 at this very moment. What we would like you to do is get a sense of just where your building is as a whole, so that as you're having conversations today, as you're thinking about moving forward, it will help you think about where people are coming from. So we're just going to have you put those cards in the center of the table. You don't have to identify yourself if you're the red, but we want you to get a sense of that. So go ahead and throw them in the center.
So by putting the cards on the table, you can see, where are you all? And we're not all at the same place. We're going to honor that. We're going to do some review for some new stuff for some, and moving on. So just keep that in mind as we go through.
So the other thing we want you to be aware of is your body language and your attitude today. So I'm sure this never happens in your building, never happens in Douglas County. I'm sure it only happens in other districts. But hypothetically, let's say we're getting into the info and you're slinking in your chair and you're going, oh my God, I'm a red card and I'm not even sure what this means. Which, honestly, it's hard work today. But one of the things that hypothetically happened yesterday was, hypothetically yesterday, we had a table that there were people who were like, oh my gosh, this makes so much sense. It's progress monitoring, it's about kids, it's about growth, and we had people who were excited.
And that's a huge thing. That's big. They're excited about Site 6.
And then at the same table, we had people who were like, yeah, nope, never gonna work for me. Not happening. And it was such a bummer because there were people at the table saying, it's about kids. Yeah, there's stuff we have to do. But there were people saying, oh my gosh, I work with struggling kids. And it's going to honor them for growth. I like this. And people who said, I do this can I say butt kicking? I do this butt kicking performance assessment task, and I get to put it in because it's what my kids value. So we had people excited at the table, and hypothetically, yesterday, we might have had a person, and it was sad because it brought down the energy level of the entire table. So, sure it won't happen here today.
So we are going to start by looking at the big picture, and this is a review for many of you, but we are going to put the year into perspective. We are going to go through and think about what this all entails. But before we do that, Jamie wants to tell you about her selfie.
So today's about a journey, And I took my 18-year-old niece to Chicago with me. I was doing training, and we went to the Chicago Institute of Art. And an 18-year-old at the Chicago Institute of Art was not loving the art. So the way that you help an 18-year-old at the Chicago Institute of Art appreciate art is you let her do selfies in every room. And you say, okay, which piece? I have 32 selfies at this art gallery. But it's really not about me in Chicago. It's really about pointillism. So George Seurat, when you get close to that famous picture, it freaks you out because you see all the little dots. You're going, who would do all these tiny, tiny little dots? And pointillism, you need to step back. You need to see the big picture. So today is about the big picture. And my friends, we have to help our colleagues see the big picture. So we're going to start with the big picture, and we're not going to get stuck in the tiny, tiny little colors, because we do not want to argue and say, no.
Is it mahogany?
No, it's not mahogany.
It's bittersweet.
It's red orange.
It's orange and it is bittersweet.
So from time
There's irony there.
Yeah.
There is irony there.
So from time to time today, when we get into the weeds and the minutia, we're going to say, yeah, not going to the crayon colors, my friend. We're going to say big picture. Step back and look at the big picture. Big picture.
Okay. Jump back for a second. Make sure you keep track of who's here, when you meet, all of those great things. In case somebody comes and says, where did this money go? You can account for it. So do make sure you do that. As we go forward, another thing to consider is as you work with staff and departments, you might want to have them sign in as well, because they are being trained in something that really is going to impact not their pay, but their educator effectiveness rating at the state level, their license and whatnot. And so you want to account for the people in your building being trained as well. It's going to be a really important piece of information for you so that you have that and can say, when they come back in May and say, Andy, never heard about Site 6, you can say, yes, you did. You signed off right here. You know the drill. So just be aware of that. Many of you have seen this or representations of these, and we are going to talk about a couple things. I'm going to start on the right with the triangle. This is what Jamie and I refer to as the balanced assessment system. And the balanced assessment system we think of as what's being done to us. What is the state making us do? This is the not so fun side of assessment, right? Many times this is what we get frustrated with. State law requires several things. It requires that we have summative practices. That's the tip of the triangle, are those summative practices. With those summative practices, they're calling it the state assessment, TCAP, CMAS, PARC. Whatever we're going to, however it's framed in the time that we're using it. This year it'll be TCAP and CMAS data that we're using. And moving forward, your kids will take CMAS, which is PARC. But anyway, that's the summative data. That's what they want as our summative assessment. And we know it doesn't happen at the end of the learning cycle. It happens in March. So we don't stop and call our year good at that point in time. The state also requires that we have interim measures in place. As high schools, we are not necessarily using MAP. Is anybody in here using MAP? Okay. So they might have pockets of kids in your school, just a few kiddos, but overall, that's not your interim measure for your building. So you are in the process, hopefully, of coming up with what those interim measures are. Common department assessments, for example, that we are tracking kids at the beginning of the year and the end of the year. This is state law. And we did not purposefully buy a third-party assessment for all our kiddos at district-wide because we are a district of choice, and with choice comes challenge, and part of that challenge is that we get to develop our own interim assessment practices, interim measures. State law. State law also says we will have formative practices in place. Doesn't say anything about what they are or what they look like. But formative informs our instruction. This is what takes up the majority of our time. This is what's most meaningful to us as teachers. Balanced assessment system. If you move to the left-hand side of the page, we now have the balanced assessment approach. So we call it the BAS and the BA because we don't have enough acronyms in Douglas County. And as we look at this, the balanced assessment approach is what we choose to do in our own classes. It's the choices I make because I know my kids and my content best. At the very end, we are backward planning. At the end, this is a unit of learning, however long that unit may be. We have the longest line, the tallest line, and that is our summative assessment practice. It could be a performance assessment. It could be a unit test. It could be some form of summative measure of the student learning. Scaffolded to that, we are assessing along the way. And those are the interims. Where are kids along the way? How do we know they're getting there? And if they're not getting there, then we need to make sure we have off-ramps. We need to be able to forge ahead for those kids who've really got it. So interim assessments allows us and the kids to know where they are with respect to that outcome at the end. The smallest lines are the formative assessment practices. Ongoing, they should be purposeful, they should be aligned. I know a lot of times we do thumbs up, thumbs down whiteboards, but there are more formal, more purposeful formative assessments that you can put in place. An exit card that really informs what you're going to do tomorrow, for example. And so you can think about that. That's stage 2 of the backward planning. And throughout the year, you're responsible for assessing the world-class outcomes for your content. The 4 C's, 21st century skills, and content. Those summatives should really be assessing at the highest order of blooms, though. In the middle, well, I'm going to back up. Stage 2, balanced assessment approach, this is also Site 2. So everything in that is about what goes into the Site 2 information. In the middle, we have the big pie. The pie is on it's the sticker Andy likes so much this morning. If you divide the pie in half, he just rolled his eyes, Jamie.
I made that sticker.
We call that someone has a lot of time.
Oh, if only. So the left-hand side of this pie is Site 1 through 5. This is teacher practice. And the practice piece has been in place for 2 years now. We have been using it. We are moving forward with it. It's Site 1 is instruction, 2 is, Site 1 is outcomes, 2 is measures. Site 3 is instruction. We'll get there eventually. And then we have 4 and 5. And those should be familiar to you if you have been in the district for any length of time. As we look at this, Site 2, the measures, it's all the kids all the time. So the balanced assessment approach is all of our kids all of the time. It's everything we do, the hundreds of assessment practices that happen throughout the year. And we are planning for those, we are doing those, we are using those to inform instruction, letting kids know where they are, progress monitoring, all those questions we asked up front. On the right-hand side of the pie, we have student performance. Student performance is Site 6. So the whole right-hand side of the pie, 50%, is on student performance. This is state law. State law says 50% will be on practice, 50% of our educator effectiveness rating will be on student performance. And student performance can be achievement or growth, though growth, as you'll see today, is what's valued most. On the performance side, this is 2 years of task forces that Sina Morgan met with. The task force said we need to drill this down into 2 or more pieces. The state law requires that we have individual portion of that pie. The individual is 40% of the entire pie. And the individual portion is all my kids. So these are the students I'm responsible for, what's going on with them. The smaller portion, the 10% of the entire pie, is the collective. That's the entire school's kids. We are all responsible for the kids that are in our building. So state law says we will have individual measures, we will have collective measures. And they, in fact, go back to this, and they say the interim practices will go into your individual measure, and the summative practices, or the Colorado Growth Model, UIP, will go into your collective measure. There's a few wonky things about that. Based on the task force recommendations, this was broken down into 2 more pieces. The individual portion can be, but doesn't have to be, broken down into a piece that is 5% of that 40. So we'd have 40 or 35% and 5. And that is a targeted group. It can be my ELL kids in my classroom. It could be a specific world-class outcome. It could be boys in writing. Any number of things. It's action research, if that's a term you're familiar with. That's the action research portion of the individual portion. So it's no longer all my kids. It's my kids who live in this specific group that I've identified. The collective can also be split in half. 5% can stay with the whole school, and 5% can go to a department. So as a department, we want to see how we're doing. We have a department assessment, and we're going to use that information. I think that's all on that one. So why don't you take a minute, talk to your shoulder partner, and look at go through just quick what AHA's information stood out today.
I like your handwriting.
It's very nice. A point of clarification here is that the targeted out of the individual is optional. In fact, I don't think we're even recommending that this year, because as a school, you may choose to include it. You may have departments that are there. It's an option. Think about it carefully before you include that. The other thing is that the team portion, the department portion in the collective is also optional. Those came out of the task force and the recommendations by the task force. As we start to learn this, we may want to simplify our models. Use the KISS principle this year. Keep it simple, right? Because this is it's a lot of information. The other thing I want to point out, because I think this is critical, is that Site 2 is all of our kids all the time. Site 6 is this much of Site 2. So we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of assessment practices. We can only use a few of those. And it's your best and your brightest to represent Site 6. It's the most meaningful, most valuable. So when people go, oh God, Site 6 is so much, we have to do so much. It's really not. It's maybe 1 or 2 measures that you're looking at, and it's keeping those as the most important things I do during the year. So you want to frame that because that's a really important piece. We're going to look at the other legal sheet now, and you're going to fold it hot dog style. This is new for the secondary folks. Hot dog style, I don't know. So fold it in half the long way. The long way. Sure, hot dogs and hamburgers, I don't know. Choose whatever you want. We are going to look at the bottom half of this page. Jamie has it on the board here. As all good backward planners do, we are going to start with the end in mind. So we're starting over here at the end of our year. The goal here, step 3 in Site 6 is one that we can really stand behind. Jamie said yesterday, we don't have to have our protective garb on, our Kevlar vests. There's no tomatoes being thrown. There might be. But, you know, we feel pretty good standing up and saying we really value step 3 in Site 6 because this is about students and this is about student learning. And that's what we're in the classroom doing. We're about students, we're about kids, we're not about all these laws and regulations and whatever else. But it's about kids. So at the end of the learning cycle, we are going to be reporting out student growth. Bless you. So we will take the student performance and we will be reporting that. That goes probably into IC. It will get sucked to some district something, and then it will get, I'm not sure that's the right word.
I think so.
Pulled. And then it will get sucked to the state. So it's going to go through the data pipeline, right, Brad? Something like this. So it is going to move through that data pipeline and be a really important part of that final measure for Site 6. So I got an email this morning that was completely misconstrued. But very clearly, for Site 6, that's the qualifier here, for Site 6, you will be choosing one student learning outcome. And student learning outcomes we'll talk about in a little bit. The state recommends 3 to 5. We're saying to heck with that. We need to learn. We need to do this. We need to practice. We are going with 1. A student learning outcome is this big, broad, transferable thing. Do you know anything that we have that might qualify as a student learning objective? Big, broad, transferable? So our world-class outcomes or 4 Cs are what teachers are going to be using. You will choose 1. That does not mean that throughout the year you're only choosing 1 world-class outcome to teach. Because remember, this is a small part. So the email I got today said, I don't have to teach any more world-class outcomes besides 1.
No.
I went, oh, such a misunderstanding. That was not intended. So you have to choose your student learning outcome and you have to gather baseline data. Baseline data, where are my kids on this outcome right now? It could be at the beginning of the year, it could be at the beginning of the unit, whatever that is. Based on that data, we are going to set growth targets. The state says a student will show a year's growth in a year's time. That's the definition of growth. A year's growth in a year's time. Similarly, a unit's growth in a unit's time. If we back that up a little bit more, we have to consider all the different levels of kids that we have in that baseline data. So we may have kids that are way down here and they have to play catch up. At the state level, it's called catch up. So they are expected to grow 1.3 years, show 1.3 years growth in a year's time, if they're to be back on track in 3 years. So for our very lowest kids, we're setting a little bit higher target, but it may still not be proficient. Probably the only achievement data you're going to want in your PIE, and this can be a school decision, but this is a recommendation, will be the CSAP TCAP data as achievement. And then beyond that, like a test at the end of the semester is not, it may not work as well for this process. So we're going to need to think about that. So they're using both the TCAP growth data tied to the Colorado Growth Model, and those who teach in a content area that was assessed by TCAP has to show achievement data. So those are the 2 requirements. So what we have then, we have our baseline data, our growth targets, and then we have to set, based on the banding of our kids, how they fall out, we are going to set growth targets for those bands most likely. At the secondary level, it is going to be really challenging. You could choose to do individual targets for kids, but that's really challenging with 180 of them. So banding seems to make more sense to Tammy and me as secondary folks. Yeah. Jamie thinks individuals are the way to go for the elementary. So,
well, and then also just to teach to them as well.
Yeah.
If you're saying this is the growth target for 150 students, can you really have 150 paths? But if you start banding them, it's more doable.
It's more
logistically, you can.
We will. We'll come back to banding later. actually. Does that work? Can you hold on to that? Okay. So I'm going to set targets for my kids who fall out down here. I'm going to set targets for my kids who are here. I'm going to set targets for my kids who are at the highest levels. They also have learning gaps for the next thing that they're doing, and we need to recognize that and set growth targets for them as well. Okay? So those growth targets become important. Then, guess what happens between this line here and the reporting is we're progress monitoring. The only data that gets entered, sucked into that pipeline, is your baseline data and your final data. The rest of it is for your information, for your use as a classroom teacher moving forward. So I may, as a former science teacher, I would have given an assessment, a science inquiry lab. I gave it the first day of school. So here goes my lab. I get baseline data I collected on all the pieces of inquiry science that I'm interested in. Then I see where the gaps are, and I go in and I teach just little, maybe the first month I spend on just prediction and problem hypothesis and design. Maybe that's my focus. And that's the only piece I assess when I progress monitor, because that's the piece that's important for that moment in time. And then I come back and I work on data analysis for the second quarter. And then I come back and I work on conclusion evaluation at the end. But the final assessment I give has to assess everything again. So I don't have to assess everything every time, okay, as I progress monitor. We want people to be smart about that. Then we go back. Number one, not very exciting or interesting. This is setting the pie, setting the categories. How many categories is your school going to have? Individual, collective, the 2, the 3, or the 4. We are also selecting the measures. The measures need to be what goes where, what's required, and what can we leave in there as options for people to choose to include. So those are the first couple steps. Along the way and throughout, and I know all of your schools have started these conversations, it's the quality assessment conversation. So do not lose that. We're not spending time on it today, but that whole quality assessment piece, is this a quality practice, a high quality practice? And is it what we value the most? Is it what's most meaningful? Does it give us great information for our students? And if it doesn't, why the heck are we doing that? We don't assess because it's Friday and I always give a test on Friday. It's not that's not a valued assessment practice. So be really clear on what you're doing and why you're doing it. Continue those conversations.
And there is a handout in your folder for this conversation, and it does live in Inspired. And so once you have access to this, I think you will like the tool in Inspired. It will walk you through those steps that we saw in the Excel spreadsheet. Sort of leads you along the way, and so it does a good job of that.
That's available to every employee?
Not yet.
Soon.
Okay.
Soon.
Once leaders set the model, it will be, and then there's an assessment library being released next week, and the PLS will be trained next Tuesday on how to use the assessment library, so they can take it back to the staff. All right, the top of the fold. This is where Tammy said, you don't just halt instruction. This is where you integrate what's most meaningful, what's most valuable, and you use that to collect the data, leverage it. So maybe somewhere in this unit here, my backwards plan unit, I've been very thoughtful about it, my interim practice here gives me the baseline data that I'm looking for. That's a real possibility. Don't come to a screeching halt and say, oh, today we're going to throw something at you that doesn't matter because Site 6 says I have to. That's not what Site 6 says. So you want to take that data. It could come from an interim. It could come from a summative. It could be that as we move forward, that something, maybe you don't want to do it the first month of school. Too many kids are changing classes. They're moving in and out. You want to do something that will capture the data when the majority of the kids are there. I may, as I progress monitor, somewhere in here, I may have in practice that helps me progress monitor to that same learning objective. Maybe my summative does, maybe something here does. So along the way, I'm progress monitoring and I'm helping students grow toward that student learning objective. What's most important, what's most meaningful, what's most valuable. Then, and I know it doesn't happen to you guys, but my kiddos checked out about mid-May, right? Maybe even early May. That was a good year when they checked out mid-May. So maybe at the end of April is where I want to collect that final data that I'm sharing with the state. One of the things we do not know right now is when this cycle ends. We don't know if it's in sync with Site 1 through 5 and the evaluation cycle. We just don't have that answer. So what we do know is this is going to happen for everybody second semester. We want the conversations to start now and start thinking about this. But the baseline data really won't be baseline data if we collected second semester through a year-long course. But we're going to go with this. And then we're going to show the growth that students have. Okay, so you want to think about that. It also means that, and we got this question yesterday, well, if we're collecting our final data for Site 6 at the end of April, that means I'm done. No. That means you're done with Site 6. That's it. Site 6 is not everything. Site 2 is everything. Jeff?
In talking to the L&L about this, question came up with social studies. A lot of their classes are 1 semester.
Right.
So what's the expectation of a social studies teacher? Is it, just what they consider a year's growth?
It's a semester's, it's whatever the unit of time is. So a unit's growth in a unit's time, a semester's growth in a semester's time. It's whatever those expectations are. We're going to run into that with electives all over the place. So it does come up. Okay? I'd like you to go ahead and put the two papers side by side. And here's the conversation we'd like you to have right now, is at your tables, what from this would help your teachers move forward in their understanding?
Want to do that? We can do that?
You can make it look, yes. Like Jeff and I were just talking about how we should do pre-iterative
With the PLC coming up, you may think about what are we going to do during the PLC day? Is this a better staff meeting conversation? Is it a department meeting conversation? How can you carry this forward? And those things you want to consider today as we move on. Okay? We are going to go back. And we're going to have you get up again. When you hear the music, you are going to stand behind your chairs.
When you hear the music, you're going to find someone who has the same color or same suit? Same suit, who's not at your table. So you're looking for, you can do a group of 2, a group of 3, same suit, not at your table, and wait for the next set of directions.
Part 2.
Now that we've sort of framed the work, we have the big picture, we're going to try to give you some time to process some of this, give you a chance to think about your models, think about where SLOs fit, what assessments get at those SLOs, what's important to us. And so we're going to start with just the model piece. And so we have in your folder, do you want me to walk them through?
No, I have it.
You have it. We have in your folder a big circle, and we also have in the principals folders some of the required assessments. And as you process through this, Chris is going to explain the activity. We want you to sort of inherit our word, which is grapple. We've decided that this is an exercise in grappling with.
That's what David said to me in my partner. He goes, people are going to have to grapple on their nose.
David's on my wavelength. He's
Grapple
scary.
with where the measurements fit the best. Grapple with what is truly important to us, what assessments we currently have that make the most sense for Site 6. Grapple with just student learning and how we go about assessing it and why those assessments are important to us.
So what we're going to have you do, everybody, like Tammy said, everybody has this. Take a second, get that out if you haven't yet. Leaders, purple folders, you have this. And we have tried to come up with all the different possible iterations for all the different possible departments that you might have in your school, that you should have, I think, in your schools. So there is a sheet at the top that says high school science, high school ELA, high school math, high school electives, world language. It has all those things there. There are several elective sheets, so people who are in that area, you can each have your own. You can play with this. We're going to recommend that you grapple with this in groups, maybe pairs, and start thinking about it. But this is the categories, selecting the categories. It's step 1 in Site 6. It's what you spent a lot of time doing last year. Step 1 in Site 6, what are my categories? Am I going to have 2, 3, or 4? And then what measures fit where in those categories? So on this sheet, the reds are required. And I want you to hear carefully, the UIP and the Colorado Growth Model likely overlap. They're likely one and the same. We have them as 2 different things on the handout here because at the elementary schools they might not have been the same thing. So you have to have the UIP represented in your plan. What we are going to ask you to do, and I'll show you a couple examples in a minute, is that you're going to take these pieces and you're going to figure out where do they go in that pie. You're going to cut them apart. You're going to put them in there. Red ones have to be on here. The green ones are all the optional assessments that you may choose to include. So the growth model, where am I going to put that? I may put it in collective. I may put it in individual. Likely collective. We are, and this is true across the state, we are living with the 2014 spring TCAP data this year and next year. Everybody's doing that. Wherever you fill out, whatever you got, you got. So that's what we live with. In light of that, you may want to put it in the collective. And certainly next year, you'll definitely want to, because those kids are so far removed from the testing frame that you want to get them out of the individual I did this, because the data's old, has a very short shelf life. The interim measures, we recommend that they go in individual. The interim measures that you have in place. And Rachel was asking, is this the common assessments? Do we have to have common assessments? That's the intent of this, is that it's a higher technical rigor, common assessments where people are really talking about them and working with them and focusing on inter-rater reliability. And hear me very carefully, a multiple choice test does not allow for inter-rater reliability. Okay, right? So you want to be really careful in saying that a multiple choice test is a good common interim measure. It's not going to play out well in the quality measures in the calculator. Just saying. So think about that very carefully. What are those interim measures that you have in place? Part of the reason this hold harmless this year at the state level is because they know that districts still need to wrestle with or grapple with coming up with quality, high quality interim measures. Okay? So that can be an in-process work that you are doing throughout this year. We have a couple examples. Brad, I'm going to stand over here by you. And you can come look at these if or when the mood strikes. But we have some examples here for high school. This is English language arts. if a state assessment is taught, achievement data must be included. English Language Arts had a test this year at the 9th and 10th grade level. You got achievement data. It needs to live somewhere. Do you put it in your individual? Do you put it in your collective? You're going to have to make that decision at a school level. Having said that, Legend High School, for example, has half their ELA department is new. They had no hold on that data whatsoever. They may want to put it in the collective piece because those teachers don't own that data, right? You may think about the players in your school. You may think about the scores that you receive. There's a lot of factors that go where you're going to put that. So TCAP has to go somewhere. The Colorado Growth Model needs to go somewhere, probably in the collective. The interim measure needs to be represented. And then the greens, what important, relevant, most meaningful, that matters most, assessments, that's the green ones, what might those be? Because if your principal doesn't include, if building leadership doesn't include those as options, then no teacher can enter that assessment. So I have a really great performance assessment that I want to do. It's a classroom level performance assessment. Tony doesn't put that in the model. I'm SOL. I can't include it. Okay? So I need to consider that as you work in your departments, as you have these conversations in your department, what needs to go there? Is it classroom interim? Is it a team? Is it what is it that I want represented here? You can, absolutely, and teachers can choose this. You can just have the two measures in your model. So I'm at Mountain Vista. I teach ELA. I only want my interim measure and my TCAP data. I don't have to do anything else. Everything else is optional. So I don't have to enter anything else. At the same time, Rachel's going, oh, but I do this great writing assessment, and I have a great summative assessment. I want to include that. We're same department. She can include that in hers. I don't have to. So you want to think about, as an IB school, you have a ton of rubrics in place, Douglas County. Use them well. You can use those for growth measures. So think about what you already have, what you already value. Math, same sort of situation. TCAP math, we know TCAP math data always falls out at the 10th grade level, right? And so maybe you want to ensure that that ends up somewhere in the collective piece. And that may be a time where you do the department collective. You have to decide. Interim measures, again, need to be included. Science and social studies. Maybe I'm at a school, Andy, that really values ACT data. And so my ACT data, I'm going to require for everybody in the collective piece of the pie. I am changing that green card to red, putting it in there. It will live there. Okay? Science and social studies, there is no TCAP data. You didn't give any science assessment in the spring, so it doesn't exist. And won't exist for 2 more years. Next year we'll be having a different conversation. But maybe my third-party AP exam really is important. And I'm tracking, as an optional assessment, my DBQs, right, Brad? We have this conversation. So the DBQs I'm giving over and over and over again, and that I can monitor at the beginning of the year. I can collect growth throughout the year. I can do something with that. So I can throw that in as an option. World language, electives, librarian, SPED, you have a similar setup. What's important, what's valuable, and going forward. The one thing, the Colorado Growth Model Measure Unified Improvement Plan, these teachers over here, it needs to be specific to the teachers who contribute to that goal. So as a world language teacher, I may not be at all focused on the math UIP goal. Instead, I'm focused on the literacy one. So that's what I'm doing down here, is the Colorado Growth Measure literacy piece. As an industrial tech, maybe math is more in line with what I teach. So I'm going to put that here. So you just have to think about what your options are and how you're going to play. This is the grappling part. So you are going to take about 15 minutes right now, and we know this is fast and furious.
And you won't have it
15
all day.
minutes. You're going to cut this apart, have those conversations. We know you're not going to finish it today, but start the conversation. Where would you want it to live? And remember, there's one other key piece here that I want you to consider, is that this is a growth measure. It is not a proficiency mastery measure. Those are very different things. I can show growth from kids who are down here to way up here, right? I can show that growth. They, in fact, grow a lot sometimes if I'm working really well with them. My kids here may only grow a little bit. So it's a growth measure, not a proficiency measure, and that's going to be important to convey as you talk with your teams and your teachers at your school.
Is it growth or achievement or both?
The state says it can be either. However, achievement data you can't set growth targets for, right? I'm getting it 1 grade at the end of the semester. How in the world do I set a growth target for that? Because for anything you're developing, yes. The state measures, TCAP, are achievement. The ACT may be an achievement measure. We'll find qualification on that. An AP exam, IB exam may be a achievement measure, likely.
We want to kind of shift your conversation just a little bit. We've sort of spent quite a bit of time on saying, okay, I have these assessments I have to put in, they're required. And I know yesterday we even talked a little bit, it feels a little bit like we're almost gaming the system. So it feels like kind of a yucky conversation because you're saying, okay, where should I put that best? Where does that fit better? So it doesn't feel that great. It feels like we sort of lose the conversation about students. We lose why we became teachers. This shift hopefully will help us kind of bring that back into focus. We have a couple things for you. One is we have a document that looks like this that is a different way to look at those assessments and where they fit into our teaching and our learning and what it is that we hold near and dear. Again, just to reemphasize, for your work this year around Site 6, we are recommending that you track, progress monitor one world-class outcome.
That's for Site 6.
For Site 6, not backward planning. This document also has 3 places just to play around with 3 different world-class outcomes. And again, that doesn't, we're not saying to you, no, now you need a progress monitor 3 for Site 6 or anything to that nature. It's just a place to consider some options. One of the things you may want to do is this. You now know what assessments you're required to do. It may be of interest to you to see, well, what do those assessments really measure? What world-class outcomes do they align to? And so one of the other pieces that we've included for you is we've included the GVCs for you, the world-class outcomes. If you look at them, 9th and 10th are the same. So you have one document that just says 9th, but 9th and 10th are the same. You have another document that says 11th. 11th and 12th are the same. And so those will match up for whatever grade or grades that you're considering. You may want to think about what assessments match up to those world-class outcomes that you hold near and dear. For instance, when I was in the science classroom, we really valued inquiry. And so if I start thinking about, well, what are those assessments? Yes, I would, if I was still in the classroom, have to give a CMAS assessment. That would get at inquiry, but it probably is fairly foundational. It's probably more around content, more around skills. And so it may not get up to that world-class level that we're talking about when we talk about our world-class outcomes. So we may, as a department, want an additional assessment to get at that. It may be that you look at these world-class outcomes and you say, you know, we really value perspective. We're social studies, and that's a really important thing to us. And we don't really think that there's any assessment that we have right now that is a must-do that gets at that. So you might start a category and say, you know, we value perspective. What are the assessments that will help us get at that? So this piece is really sort of a balance and an alignment piece where you're trying to say what will balance out the assessments that are required of me and what other assessments would I like to include to sort of balance that piece out, but then also balance out the fact that maybe the assessments that we are required at this point are fairly low level and I need to assess a little bit higher.
So, Tammy,
Go ahead.
as you start thinking about that, you mean when I choose my world-class outcome, I need to make sure my assessments align to that world-class outcome, my measures are aligned to it. I'm not just throwing in random assessments that I like.
Correct. We've talked a little bit, and we'll continue that conversation with you as we get a little further along about what are the success criteria? What are the things that are making up that world-class outcome for us, and do those assessments match up to each of those success criteria that we're looking at?
We had our quals last week, so there's a few quals in the room. We had our quals last week come up with what was most meaningful to them, what was nearest and dearest to their heart. And this over here captures what they said. It's not the only thing they said. These received the most tallies. So in social studies, it was justify your role as a global contributor. In math, it was make sense of problems and persevere in solving them. In social studies, science, ELA, health, demonstrate the process of inquiry. So their world language, create meaning strategically through conversation. So those were the ones that they said they held near and dear. That doesn't mean that's what you hold near and dear, but that conversation needs to happen on a very personal level. What is it that I hold? Again, this doesn't have to be a departmental SLO. It can be individual, but all my measures need to align to it.
We're going to allow for you to have 15 minutes, 10 minutes, a 10-minute conversation just to sort of shift that perspective slightly from what is required of me to what do I really value? What is near and dear to me? How do the assessments I have to do line up? What am I progress monitoring? Take a look at these, take a look at this.
The exercise you did, cutting apart the red and the green, and then aligning them with an SLO, is a checks and balance. When I did this from the perspective of third grade, elementary, they have to do literacy and numeracy, so they don't get the choices you get. So I have 3 SLOs when I did this. 1 for reading, 1 for writing, and 1 for math. So I did that first. Then I took my required red and I aligned them under the SLO. What I discovered when I did this the first time, I had 1 measure for math, and that was the state test. Can't progress monitor the state test that happens in March. Not great data that I have to wait until August to get anyway. So I realized I had to go back to my red and green sheets, and I had to say, I need another assessment, a building teacher common assessment that I can use so I could progress monitor. So we've said, let's learn how to do 1 SLO. 1 per content or 1 per building. We don't care, but let's learn how to do 1. The state says 3 to 5. If I'm an elementary teacher, and this conversation came up with our elementary peeps yesterday afternoon, honestly, they should be doing the content they're doing. But we're saying let's practice 1. When I did this the first time, I had 2 here, 2 here, 1 here. I realized I was putting all of my eggs in the state basket. And I wanted to leverage and have balance in my assessment practices. You want a body of evidence that shows your kids. So it told me to go back and find another measure.
We want to leave you a little bit of time to grapple with, we're going to jump, with the step 3, which is really where we're going to set growth targets based off of baseline data. So let's pretend that we've all landed on an SLO. Let's also pretend that we have baseline data. Okay, so we have this baseline data. It's raw. It is just as we get it from our students. We have to set growth targets for those students. In your folder, all of you have an example of this, and it's an example of raw data. So I'll let you find that. Just go ahead and take a moment and find that last document. So what you have is on the front you get a little bit of information about what the SLO is that this teacher has landed on, what the class is, what the interval instruction is, and what evidence that they're using. And it gives you a little bit about the scale. I believe that the maximum score is 18 points. On the back side, you have your students. And so you have student A through student W. You have the 3 sort of sub-components, the success criteria within that, and you have this overall score. What are you going to do with those students? How are you going to set growth targets for those? The beginning of our time together, we talked just a little bit, we alluded to this idea of maybe you're going to want to think about your students in terms of performance bands or at least some way to sort of group them together, because a couple things. One is you can't set growth targets for 150 students and then necessarily, or 180 students, have individual growth plans that you're going to meet and differentiate for all the students. It's just not logistically possible. So you may have to think about grouping them so that you can get to their learning needs. So there's no magic number here. Maybe you're going to say, I'm going to look at my data and I'm going to say what's kind of the middle of the road, sort of what we tend to think of as who we teach to, who are sort of the higher group, who's sort of that lower group, and maybe there's a couple of outlier individuals that you're actually going to just think about individually. So you'd end up with 3 big bands of students and a couple other students that you're going to think about for teaching, for learning, and progress monitoring and setting growth targets for. All we want you to do today, we're going to only give you 5 minutes, you don't have a lot of time, is think about, process, how would you look at data like this and what would you do with that? How would you start grouping students together? How would you start thinking about setting a growth target for those groups if you set up groups, or if you did have, do you have an individual student that you need to think about just a little bit differently because of the data that you have in front of you?
You can't just say, oh, I teach choir, I don't have AP, I don't have ACT, I don't have TCAP, so I don't have, they've got to find an area to connect. That's my current level of understanding with that.